Late last year, I finished George Eliot's novel, The Mill on the Floss. It is the story of a family, and the main character begins the story as a young girl. Her dad runs the mill that sits on the River Floss, and as the story goes on and she grows older, she just lives through tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. And if you want to know what those are, you have to read the book yourself. But as it gets to the end, she is in a spot where she's kind of all alone. She doesn't have anybody to confide in or turn to anymore. And she goes into town and she visits with Dr. Ken. I think he's the town parson. And she starts to kind of tell him everything and wonders if he can be of help. And he tells her that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he has been granted an experience, a long experience of life that he hopes will be of help to her. So what he's saying is that all of the things that have happened in his life, all of the parts of his story, he hopes have put him in a place where he can then share this journey with her and be of some help in the journey that she is now on in the particular time of her struggle. Now, all of us have been, as he was, granted an experience. We've all been granted an experience, right? It's just the life that we live and the stories that shape us. And as we hear this Epiphany story of these magi, these wise men coming to visit the baby Jesus, we don't know what experience they have been granted. We don't know what struggles they had. We know that they followed the star to just come and honor Jesus, but they may also have their own hurts, their own healing that's needed. We don't know any of that. Which is why I found the reading from Isaiah this week much helpful in terms of understanding what it might have been that the wise men were bringing and coming to Jesus with. The passage from Isaiah comes from the 60th chapter. To get to the 60th chapter of Isaiah, you have to kind of back up to the people living in the promised land. They have kings, they have prophets. The prophets tell them, hey, we're not behaving very well. If we don't get our act together, bad things are going to happen. Eventually, bad things do happen. The Babylonians come and carry them off into exile, tear down the temple, tear down the city. At that point in time, the prophets would say, hey, it's not always going to be bad. God keeps God's promises. By the time you get to the 60th chapter of Isaiah, they've all gone back. The Persians have come into power and said, you can go home. So they've gone home, and do they find a nice rebuilt city to live in? No, they find rubble, right? They find a city wall that's just laying where it was when it got torn down. They find a temple that's still not been rebuilt. And it's into that the prophet says, arise, your light has come. The glory of the Lord shines upon you. And as the passage goes on, the prophet says, all of your sons will be gathered in. Because when they got carried off, right, you get scattered. So all of your sons will be gathered in, your daughters will be brought home. The light of God is shining and will shine through you. That all sounds pretty wonderful. But that is all happening at a time when they have not yet fully lived into the wholeness and healing that should come with their restoration. They are not all the way there. And it's in the midst of their not being all the way there that we hear that there is a darkness that will descend on the earth. A thick darkness. Now, we have a skylight in our bathroom, and that has helped me understand the different kinds of darkness. When there's a good full moon and a cloudless sky, sometimes it feels like we forgot to turn the light off, and you can walk around in the dark, but it's not really dark. Thick darkness is something different. You give us some good, heavy, stormy cloud cover without any light up there, and all of a sudden you got to feel your way around a little bit in the dark. So as the people of Israel are being told by the prophet, arise, your light has come, the glory of the Lord shines on you, everybody's going to get gathered back in, but there's also darkness that's going to descend on the earth, and it's going to be very thick. This starts to call to mind the story that the people of Israel, the story they were granted with, their experience. And if you back up and read through the Old Testament, it is very much a story of tragedy. There is, you remember Joseph's brothers sold him off into slavery, right? And later they found him again. They found him because there was a famine. So the economics of food drove them out of their land back into Egypt. Eventually they got enslaved in Egypt. So they went from hunger, economic scarcity, into this place of being slaves. They get freed from that, and then they have to live in the wilderness for 40 years. That's not an easy journey. constant complaining and mumbling to God about the lack of water and the lack of food and all of the rest of the struggles of living in the wilderness. They eventually make it to the promised land where there's lots of war, right? As they fight with the people who already live there. The story of Ruth and Naomi is a story of famine as they leave one land and then encounter the grief of lost sons and husbands and come back. The story of Esther is a story of threatened violence against a whole ethnic group of people. And when you keep going all through this, you just see war, violence, famine, economic struggles, tyranny. This is the story of the people of Israel. So when they come out of the exile and they are told, arise, your light has come, they have lived through whole bunches of darkness. They have lived through the worst of the stuff that you can live through as people. So when you start then to think about thick darkness landing on the earth, the story of the people of Israel gives you a little bit of a sense of what it might look like. So when we think today, when we hear the prophets say the thick darkness might sit, we can start to wonder, what does that look like in our world? Now, we can have our own personal struggles, right? You might have a struggle with addiction or depression or a marriage struggle, whatever those things are. And that can be your own personal darkness. But this is about whole peoples living in darkness, right? It says, arise, your light, you people of Israel, has come. There's going to be a thick darkness on the peoples. So if you take the story of the people of Israel and say, where today do we see people living with famine? Where today do we see people fleeing war? Where today do we see people living in tyranny and fleeing from violence, whether it's violence of a dictator or a gang? Where today do we see people living in camps that are not homes because they are refugees from whether it be economic brokenness or the violence that sits in our world? And it's all around the world, right? We've got refugees and immigrants and all sorts of people that are struggling. And if you ask them if they live in thick darkness, they might go, yeah. Just like when we're trying to find our way around in darkness, if you live in a refugee camp, you don't know how that's going to end. If you're on a journey running away from home and leaving everything behind, you don't know how that's going to end. So when we hear these words spoken to this people of Israel, it's a darkness that should be at least something we know we observe, right? And it says, rise, your light has come, thick darkness is coming, and then the nations are going to be drawn to your light. And what I think this is saying is that even as the people of Israel stand amidst the rubble of what used to be home, their healing is not all the way there yet. Their restoration is not all the way there yet, but it has started. And even though it's not all the way there yet, God is saying, and yet the people that live in darkness are going to come to you. They're going to find you. And if you back up again in Israel's story, you remember that Abraham was blessed to be a blessing. That they were created to be a priestly people that was going to bring blessing to the world. And what the story tells us is they don't have to have life altogether to be that blessing. And that maybe the restoration that comes to them comes in part by participating in the healing of other people. So we can think about this to get our minds around a little bit in more personal terms. Sometimes you think about the struggles we have, perhaps addiction being one of them, a 12-step group like Alcoholics Anonymous. When people gather in a meeting like that to have conversation together, are they, some of them, all of them, in need of healing? Are they a healing presence for one another? Yes. Even though none of them are perfect and got it all figured out, right? So in the midst of that, each of them has been granted an experience, and that experience becomes part of a journey that becomes part of a healing presence for someone else, even though their healing is not all the way there yet. I had a young woman once whose husband left her, and she was surrounded by other young couples, none of whom had been granted that kind of an experience yet. And she walked into church one Sunday and was surrounded by a group of women, some of whom had experienced that, others of whom had their own struggles, but all of whom had the wisdom of years. And they gathered around her and journeyed with her because they had been granted this experience. And even though they all had their own struggles, some of them were dealing with aging parents that had serious health concerns. Some of them had kids that were kind of off the chain and they were trying to figure out how to live in that space. Others of them had their own health concerns. Even though they needed healing, they could be a healing presence for her because of the experience that they have been granted. So this works in our own lives, but the story is not about our own personal journeys. It's about this whole of the people of Israel. It's looking at the people of Israel and saying, "Rise, your light has come. And even though you're not restored all the way yet, people are going to come to you because you are my healing presence in the world. Now, if you take their story and keep going, more experience happens. Jesus is born not in some other group of people, but amongst this people of Israel. And the first thing that happens is he gets visited by these magi from the east. We don't know what happens to them, but they were drawn to that light. Maybe they were in need of some healing themselves. And this journey was part of them discovering what restoration looked like for them. But if we keep reading in the story, where does Jesus head next? Egypt. Jesus becomes a refugee. Jesus has to leave because Herod's out to kill him. And when you keep reading in the story, even beyond Jesus' death and resurrection, right? He finds the cross as the place where all of that suffering kind of lands. And Jesus comes out the other side into this new gift of life we've been given. If you keep going all the way to the last book of the Bible, which is Revelation. That was written to a group of refugees who had come out of a war with Roman Empire and traveled around the Mediterranean to a different place. They were poor. They were living in a new land. The apostles were dying off. They were considered unpatriotic because they wouldn't worship the emperor. And this is who Revelation is written to. So the story continues. And that group of people was granted an experience. And out of that experience, they shared their stories with other people and walked alongside other people, so that part of their healing, no doubt, was in being a healing presence for others. So as we gather on this Epiphany Sunday, and we think about the darkness and the thick darkness that might be in our world, it may be that we can turn and look at our own experience. We can look to Jesus and the death and resurrection that frees us to have life, and then come forward from that and say, how did we all get here? What is our experience? And it is always not just our own life, but the experience of generations. And if we were to take just this little group of us and trace us back, I guarantee you we would find ancestors that fled famine. We would find ancestors that fled religious tyranny. We would find ancestors that were refugees of some sort, whether it was economic or oppression or whatever it might be. That's part of all of our stories. And so we have been granted these experiences, and we lose track of those stories sometimes. But when we can remember them and know that that's where we came from, which is what the people of Israel did, right? They said, we used to be slaves, and then we were in exile, and then this happened, right? They've given all of this gift of experience, and out of that then came healing by participating in the healing of others. So we as God's church now are the light of the world. This star that we have that was the manger, and before that was graffiti, right? It represents the tension of that. It's got written into it the brokenness and the struggles that we wrestled with during Advent. But now those brokenness and struggles are part of a star that shines light into the world, which means that we, as a whole body, have our struggles, but we also have our hope, and somehow God's light managed to shine through all of that in us. And that our healing may just come full circle when we participate in the healing of others. Now, we are not the healer. That's Jesus. We are Jesus' healing presence, and that light shines through us. So as we head through the rest of this season of Epiphany and head towards Ash Wednesday, where we really start to wrestle with brokenness, may we be blessed to be that light, to know that God's light shines in us, and that by shining through us, it will bring healing to people, and healing to us as God's grace continues to go to work. Amen.